Picture this: a flickering torch casts eerie shadows across a stone corridor, where hushed voices weave plots thick with danger. Behind every tapestry, beneath every goblet of wine, power hangs in the balance, waiting to be seized or stolen. This wasn't just the backdrop of medieval life, it was the heartbeat of an empire. Welcome to a world where politics wasn't debated in open chambers, but whispered in the dark, where a single slip of the tongue could mean exile or worse. Today, we're stepping into the labyrinth of beneath the cauldron, political intrigue inside the castle's steaming heart, where the Game of Thrones wasn't just a story, it was survival. Think of the medieval court as a chessboard, where every player, kings, queens, bishops, even pawns, had a role in the grand strategy. But here's the twist: the most powerful moves weren't made on the battlefield. They happened over feasts laced with poison, in letters written in code, or through marriages brokered like trade deals. The stakes, nothing less than control of kingdoms. And the players, they were masters of disguise, spinning webs of loyalty and betrayal so intricate, even their closest allies couldn't always tell friend from foe. What made these schemes so gripping wasn't just the ambition, it was the artistry. Every plot was a carefully crafted performance, designed to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately dominate. So why does this shadowy world still captivate us centuries later? Perhaps because beneath the velvet gloves and jeweled crowns, these figures weren't so different from us. They feared loss, hungered for power, and gambled everything on their wits. Their stories remind us that politics has always been a theater, one where the script is written in secret and the audience never sees the strings being pulled. As we journey through these corridors of power together, you'll uncover the hidden mechanisms that shaped history, and maybe even catch echoes of them in our world today. The chessboard is set, the players are ready. All that's left is to step into the game. To truly grasp the power plays of a medieval court, you have to see it as an intricate machine, one where every cog, no matter how small, could shift the entire mechanism. At the center stood the monarch, not just as a ruler but as the ultimate prize, surrounded by a swirling storm of ambition. The chancellor, often a clergyman or learned advisor, wasn't just a scribe, he was the gatekeeper of knowledge, deciding which petitions reached the king's desk and which vanished into obscurity. Then there was the chamberlain, a role that might seem mundane until you realize he decided who entered the royal chambers. A well-placed bribe or favor could mean the difference between influence and irrelevance. But the real puppeteers often operated in the shadows. Take the humble cupbearer, for example. While his job was to serve wine, his proximity to the ruler made him a prime target for corruption, or worse, poison. Even the court jester, with his biting humor, wasn't just entertainment. His jokes could mask dangerous truths delivered under the guise of folly. And let's not forget the ladies-in-waiting, whose whispered conversations in private chambers were as politically charged as any council meeting. What made this system so volatile was its fragility. A favored noble one day could be exiled the next, based on nothing more than a rumor spread by a rival. Loyalty was currency, but trust was a luxury few could afford. The court was a living, breathing entity, constantly shifting as alliances formed and crumbled. To survive here, you didn't just need power, you needed the skill to wield it without ever seeming to grasp for it. After all, the moment someone noticed you reaching for the throne was the moment you became a threat. The royal favor wasn't just a pat on the back. It was life itself in the medieval court. To catch the king or queen's eye meant access to land, titles, and influence most could only dream of. But like a candle burning too bright, Those who shone the brightest often attracted the most dangerous shadows. Consider Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's once indispensable advisor. One day, he was orchestrating the king's marriages and reshaping England's religious landscape. The next, he was kneeling on the executioner's block, his meteoric rise undone by whispers of treason and a single misstep in the ever-shifting sands of royal opinion. Winning favor was an art form. Some, like Cardinal Wolsey, built their fortunes on flattery so lavish it bordered on theater, gifting palaces like Hampton Court to the king, as if mere words weren't enough to prove loyalty. Others turned to spectacle, like medieval bishops who staged miraculous events to impress pious rulers. Then there were the strategic marriages, where noble families traded daughters like chess pieces, each union a calculated move to edge closer to the throne. The Seymour family's rise under Henry VIII is a masterclass in this. Jane Seymour's marriage to the king didn't just elevate her, it catapulted her entire lineage into the inner circle overnight. But here's the cruel irony of royal favor. The moment you became indispensable was the moment you became expendable. Kings and queens needed favorites to rely on, but they also needed scapegoats when plans went awry. A favorite's wealth made them envied, their influence made them feared, and their proximity to power made them vulnerable. The same courtiers who toasted your success one evening might be drafting your arrest warrant by morning. Even the most skilled players understood this dance. Survival meant knowing when to push forward and when to fade into the background. The fall of favorites wasn't just about personal failure, it was a political tool. A public downfall served as a warning to others, a reminder that no one was untouchable. When William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, was exiled and murdered in the 15th century, it wasn't just about his misdeeds, it was a spectacle designed to reinforce royal authority. The message was clear: loyalty kept you in favor, but only as long as the ruler found it convenient. Perhaps that's why the most astute courtiers mastered the art of subtlety. They built alliances quietly, donated to monasteries to cultivate a reputation for piety, and ensured their victories never outshone their sovereigns. The cleverest ones, like Elizabeth I's spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham, made themselves invisible while pulling strings from the shadows, because in the end, the safest place wasn't always in the spotlight. It was just close enough to warm yourself by the fire, but never so close you risked getting burned. Marriage in the medieval world was less a joining of hearts than a clashing of crowns, a diplomatic maneuver where love was often the least important consideration. Take Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose union didn't just bind two people but fused two kingdoms, creating the foundation of modern Spain. Their marriage contract was as meticulously drafted as a peace treaty, with clauses outlining everything from military support to how their children would inherit their combined realms. This wasn't romance, it was realpolitik dressed in wedding finery. But not all marital chess games ended in triumph. For every power couple like Ferdinand and Isabella, there were figures like Anne of Brittany, wed first to a Holy Roman Emperor by proxy at age 12, then forcibly remarried to the French King Charles VIII to secure his claim to her lands. When Charles died unexpectedly, she was hurriedly betrothed to his successor, Louis XII, all before her 21st birthday. Anne's life wasn't her own. Her marriages were transactions, her body a living treaty. The stakes of these alliances could be terrifyingly high. The broken betrothal between Richard II of England and a French princess didn't just cause a diplomatic spat, it helped reignite the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, Henry VIII's obsession with securing a male heir through serial marriages didn't just disrupt his personal life. It shattered England's ties to the Catholic Church, altering the course of religious history. Each annulment or divorce sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe as nobles scrambled to recalibrate their own alliances in the wake of royal whims. And what of the women caught in these games? Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine wielded remarkable influence, but others suffered quieter fates. Joan of England, married off to the King of Sicily as part of her brother, Richard the Lionheart's crusade negotiations, found herself widowed and imprisoned before she turned 20. Even the most privileged brides could become pawns overnight, their worth measured in acres of land or months of truce, their happiness irrelevant to the ledger books of statecraft. Yet amid all this calculation, there were moments of startling humanity. The letters between Margaret of Austria and her second husband, Philibert of Savoy, revealed genuine affection, a rare glimpse of tenderness in an institution built on cold strategy. Perhaps that's why these stories still resonate. They remind us that even in a world where hearts ranked below heraldry and harvests, human connections could still flicker, defiant and unscripted, like candlelight in a vault of stone. The medieval church was a colossus that cast its shadow far beyond the altar, its fingers wrapped around crowns as tightly as rosaries. Bishops and abbots sat not just in choir stalls but in council chambers, their influence stretching from the spiritual to the shockingly temporal. Take Cardinal Wolsey, the butcher's son who rose to become Henry VIII's right hand, orchestrating foreign policy while wearing a cardinal's red hat. Or Thomas Becket, the archbishop whose defiance of royal authority turned Canterbury Cathedral into a martyr's shrine and a political lightning rod. These men weren't merely servants of God. They were power brokers who understood that salvation and sovereignty often traveled the same road. Nowhere was this collision more explosive than in the Investiture controversy, an 11th century showdown that reshaped Europe. When Pope Gregory VII declared that only the Church could appoint bishops, stripping emperors of their traditional privilege, Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV responded by marching his army to Rome. But Gregory had a weapon sharper than any sword: excommunication. The emperor, frozen out of the sacraments and thus the path to heaven, stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside Canossa Castle, begging forgiveness. It was a masterstroke of political theater that proved even kings knelt before the Church's authority. Monasteries, often imagined as quiet retreats, were anything but. Their scriptoriums didn't just copy scriptures, they curated narratives. The venerable beads, ecclesiastical history of the English people, didn't merely record events. It shaped national identity by weaving saintly miracles into the origin stories of kingdoms. Meanwhile, abbots like Suger of St. Denis used their wealth to bankroll kings, turning their monasteries into de facto treasuries. When William the Conqueror needed to justify his invasion of England in 1066, he didn't just bring knights, he brought a papal banner, transforming a land grab into a holy crusade. But this fusion of faith and power had a dark underside. The very monasteries that preserved knowledge also sanitized it. Chronicles written by monks loyal to their royal patrons often adjusted facts, erasing defeats, inflating victories, and turning messy reality into divine propaganda. When King John of England clashed with the Church over taxes, Pope Innocent III didn't just excommunicate him, he placed the entire kingdom under interdict, banning baptisms and burials until the king capitulated. It was spiritual warfare with very earthly consequences, starving souls to starve a treasury. Perhaps the most ironic twist was how seamlessly the Church mirrored the courts it sought to guide. Bishops lived like princes, their palaces stocked with fine wines and imported silks. The papal court in Avignon became so notorious for its extravagance that critics called it the Babylonian captivity, a nod to its decadence. Yet for all its worldly flaws, this system held kingdoms together. Coronation rites anointed rulers as God's chosen. turning fragile dynasties into divine mandates. When Joan of Arc needed legitimacy to lead armies, it wasn't a noble title she sought. It was the Church's approval, a celestial stamp on her mission. The lesson was clear. In an age where divine right justified earthly rule, controlling the gatekeepers of heaven meant controlling the fate of nations. The Church didn't just whisper in the ears of kings, it sometimes wore their crowns. And when the altar and the throne clashed, the echoes shook continents. In the flickering candlelight of medieval corridors, information wasn't just power. It was a blade honed to razor sharpness, wielded by unseen hands. Every castle had its shadows, figures who moved like ghosts between the tapestries, their ears tuned to whispers others would kill to suppress. The laundress folding a noble's linens might note bloodstains hinting at an illicit duel. The groom brushing down horses could overhear plans for a midnight rendezvous. Even the court fool with his jingling bells might slip a coded message into a seemingly nonsensical rhyme. This was the invisible web that held kingdoms together or tore them apart. Take the case of Anne Boleyn, whose downfall was orchestrated not just by Henry VIII's wrath, but by a chorus of whispered accusations. Musicians in her chambers were tortured until they confessed to being her lovers, their words extracted like teeth. The evidence, hearsay from servants who claimed to have seen glances, touches, or worse. In a world where trust was as fragile as parchment, the line between rumor and treason was often just a matter of who told the story first. The system was brutally efficient. Monarchs like Elizabeth I employed master spies like Sir Francis Walsingham, whose network stretched from Edinburgh to Constantinople. His agents intercepted letters written in invisible ink, bribed foreign servants, and even planted false documents to lure traitors into the open. But the real genius lay in the mundane, a stable boy paid to report which nobles met in secret, or a seamstress noting who ordered mourning clothes before a death was announced. These were the threads that wove the tapestry of intrigue. Not all informants acted out of loyalty. Many were coerced, like the prisoners offered pardons in exchange for betraying their friends. Others played both sides, like the Italian diplomat whose double life funded his lavish lifestyle until his severed head ended up on a pike. The most dangerous spies were often the ones you'd least suspect, the pious monk recording confessions, or the childhood friend who suddenly asked too many questions about your plans. What made these networks so terrifying was their unpredictability. A single slip, a drunken boast at a tavern, a letter left unburned, could unravel years of careful plotting. When the Duke of Buckingham was executed for treason in 1521, the fatal evidence came from his own steward, who documented every incriminating conversation. The lesson was clear. In a world where walls had ears, silence was the only safe companion. Yet for all their ruthlessness, these systems had a strange irony. The very paranoia that fueled them could become their undoing. Kings who trusted no one often found themselves isolated, ruling over courts too frightened to speak the truth. And sometimes the whispers weren't lies at all, just inconvenient truths rising like smoke from the cauldron of power until they choked those who tried to contain them. Assassination in the medieval world was never just murder, it was theatre. When Archbishop Thomas Becket bled out on Canterbury Cathedral's cold stones in 1170, his killers weren't merely silencing a troublesome priest. They were staging a spectacle, one meant to terrify any who dared defy royal will. The 4 knights who struck him down didn't skulk in shadows. They marched in broad daylight, their swords ringing against sacred ground. And that was the point. Some deaths were meant to be whispered, others needed to echo. The princes in the tower took the opposite approach, vanishing so completely their fate became Europe's most enduring ghost story. Two boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, lodged in the Tower of London by their uncle Richard III, simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no confessions, just an empty chamber and a kingdom's horrified speculation. Was it strangulation, poison, a midnight burial beneath a stairwell? The genius of the crime, if crime it was, lay in its ambiguity. Without proof, accusations turned to mist, leaving Richard's enemies powerless to rally outrage while his allies could shrug at rumors. But not all assassinations relied on mystery. Some flaunted their brutality, like the murder of Duke Orsini in 1517, stabbed 26 times by his rival's henchmen during a papal procession. The message there was unmistakable. No one, not even under the Pope's gaze, was beyond reach. Others were clinical in their precision. Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV discovered this when enemies blinded him with hot irons, a wound ensuring he'd never rule again but leaving him alive as a walking cautionary tale. Poison, the weapon of cowards and queens alike, offered deniability. Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare Borgia allegedly kept a secret ledger tracking which cardinals had drunk from their special wine cellar. Meanwhile, the Medici family perfected the art of the convenient illness, with Lorenzo de' Medici surviving one poisoning attempt only to succumb years later to what some historians suspect was a slower, subtler dose. What made these acts so chilling wasn't the violence itself, but the calculus behind it. Every assassination served dual purposes, removing an obstacle and educating observers. When William Rufus, King of England, took an arrow through the lung during a hunt in 1100, the official story called it a tragic accident. Yet the speed with which his brother Henry seized the treasury and the crown suggested darker designs. Likewise, the murder of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy in 1419 wasn't just personal vengeance, it fractured an entire alliance, reshaping the 100 Years' War. Even failed attempts carried weight. The plot to kill Elizabeth I via poison pommel, a saddle laced with toxins meant to seep through her gloves, failed, but the revelation that her own cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, had endorsed it sealed Mary's execution. Sometimes the aftermath was deadlier than the dagger. In the end, these weren't crimes of passion but cold equations. A ruler's death could avert a war or start one, bankrupt a treasury or fill it. The true art lay not in the strike itself, but in the silence afterward, the way a single drop of blood could ripple through history, rewriting alliances, toppling dynasties, and reminding every player that in this game, no peace was ever truly safe. A glove tossed carelessly onto a banquet table could start wars or end them. In the high-stakes theater of medieval courts, every gesture carried layers of meaning sharper than any dagger. When King Philip of France sent English King Edward III a gift of tennis balls, it wasn't sportive goodwill, it was a blistering insult, implying Edward was a boy playing games rather than a ruler worthy of respect. The message was clear enough to spark the 100 Years' War. Such was the power of symbolism, a language where silence spoke volumes and objects became declarations of war. Take the white falcon, its wings stretched in offering. To receive one from a rival wasn't just an exchange of birds, it was a sacred vow of truce, as binding as any signed treaty. Yet the same creature could become a weapon if delivered with a limp wrist, suggesting the giver's contempt. Even fruit bore hidden barbs. A basket of plump peaches signaled esteem, but send pears with rotten cores, and you declared your enemy unfit to bear heirs. These weren't petty slights, they were calibrated strikes designed to wound without leaving visible scars. Then there were the dances, those intricate performances where every step was a cipher. The Dance of the Seven Veils, often dismissed as mere spectacle, was actually a labyrinth of loyalty tests. As veils dropped, so too did masks. Nobles who failed to recognize hidden symbols in the choreography revealed their ignorance, or worse, their disloyalty. A misstep here could exile a courtier from favor as swiftly as any treasonous plot. The most dangerous gestures were those wrapped in plausible deniability. A queen might accidentally drop her fan near a disgraced duke, forcing him to kneel, both a humiliation and a test of obedience. When Richard the Lionheart received a goblet from a rival and drank deeply, his willingness to risk poison demonstrated trust. But when he then offered the same cup to his host, he flipped the script. Now the burden of honor or guilt rested on the giver. Even clothing could be a battlefield. The length of a sleeve, the tilt of a hat, each choice whispered alliances. After Eleanor of Aquitaine's rebellion against Henry II, she appeared at court wearing a gown embroidered with eagles, symbols of her ancestral lands. It was a silent roar of defiance stitched in silk. Meanwhile, the Duke of Burgundy's decision to wear plain wool at a summit wasn't modesty. It was a calculated snub to rivals dripping in jewels, implying their wealth came at the people's expense. To navigate this world required more than etiquette. It demanded fluency in a language without dictionaries. The wrong bow, too deep, suggested submission. Too shallow implied disrespect could fracture alliances years in the making. A misplaced ring, turned gem side inward, might secretly signal distress to allies across the hall. Those who mastered this dance thrived. Those who misread a gesture often didn't live to regret it. Perhaps that's why these rituals endured long after swords rusted. They were the original power moves, a way to wage war without bloodshed, where the sharpest weapons were a raised eyebrow or a strategically broken seal. In a world where words could be denied, symbols were the truths everyone saw but few dared name. Grain was more than sustenance in the medieval world. It was a loaded crossbow aimed at the heart of a kingdom. When the Duke of Burgundy blockaded Paris in the early 15th century, he didn't need siege engines or battering rams. By cutting off wheat shipments, he turned the streets into a pressure cooker of hunger and unrest, forcing the French crown to its knees without a single clash of steel. This was economic warfare at its most elegant, bloodless on the surface, devastating in effect. The Hanseatic League, that shadowy consortium of merchant guilds, mastered this art. By controlling the flow of Baltic timber, salt, and fur, they could make or break kings, need a monarch to lower tariffs. Suddenly, their ships bypassed his ports, leaving warehouses empty and customs coffers barren. Want to punish a rebellious city? A whisper in the right ear could see its merchants frozen out of trading hubs from Novgorod to London. Their power was so absolute that when Edward IV of England dared challenge them, the League simply embargoed English wool, crippling the crown's primary source of revenue until he capitulated. But the real genius lay in the subtler manipulations. Counterfeit coins, meticulously debased with cheaper metals, could flood a rival's economy like slow-acting poison. Imagine peasants bringing their wages to market, only to find their coins rejected as worthless, blaming not the unseen forgers but their own rulers for the crisis. The Byzantine Empire weaponized this tactic against the Ottomans, destabilizing their currency until soldiers' pay bought little more than a loaf of bread. Even nature could be co-opted into this silent conflict. A well-timed rumor about blighted crops could send grain prices skyrocketing, allowing speculators to buy up reserves and sell them back at ruinous markups. The Venetian Republic turned this into high art, using its spy networks to forecast harvests months in advance, then cornering markets before competitors knew what hit them. What made these tactics so insidious was their deniability. When a king's revenues mysteriously dried up, was it bad luck or a rival's banker calling in debts? When ships sank with suspicious regularity, was it storms or sabotage, the victim often couldn't prove malice, only suffer the consequences, and that was the point. In a world where outright war risked papal censure or peasant revolt, economic strangulation offered rulers a way to wage battles where the casualties were ledgers, not lives, at least until the starving masses took up pitchforks. Yet for all its refinement, this system had one brutal constant: the weakest always paid the highest price. When tariffs rose or ships vanished, nobles dined on spiced venison while laborers starved. The true cost of these shadow wars wasn't measured in vaults of gold, but in the hollow eyes of children scraping mold from bread crusts. Perhaps that's why these strategies endure even today, because money, as it turns out, has always been the sharpest blade of all. Exile wasn't just punishment, it was social annihilation. Picture a nobleman who once dined on silver plates, now standing beyond the castle gates with nothing but the clothes on his back. His land seized, his name struck from records, even his family forbidden to speak of him. This was the medieval equivalent of hitting delete on a life. For the aristocracy, whose power was rooted in bloodlines and acres, banishment cut deeper than any blade. Without title or territory, a lord became a ghost, technically alive but erased from the world that mattered. Yet some exiles refused to fade quietly. Take Dante Alighieri, cast out of Florence in 1302 during a political purge. While lesser men might have crumbled, he channeled his rage into ink, crafting the Divine Comedy, a masterpiece that damned his enemies to literary hell while ensuring his own immortality. His revenge wasn't rebellion, it was rewriting history itself, placing his foes in circles of torment while his words outlived their dynasties. Others chose more direct comebacks. Margaret of Anjou, the fiery Queen of England's Henry VI, was exiled twice, first to Scotland, then to France after her husband's overthrow. Lesser women might have accepted defeat, but Margaret turned banishment into a recruitment tour. She bargained with foreign courts, rallied loyalists, and even led armies back across the Channel in a relentless bid to reclaim her son's throne. Her determination exposed exile's fatal flaw. As long as the banished still breathed, they remained a threat. Kings knew this too well. When Henry IV usurped Richard II's crown, he didn't just exile his predecessor, he locked him in Pontefract Castle, then spread word Richard had starved himself. A suspicious death, quietly staged, ensured no triumphant return. The lesson: banishment only worked if the exiled lacked allies or audacity. For every Dante or Margaret, though, there were broken men like Thomas More, who withered in the Tower of London after refusing to endorse Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Stripped of ink and visitors, his brilliance flickered out in isolation. Or consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, imprisoned for 16 years by her own husband after supporting their son's rebellion. Her cages were gilded chambers instead of dungeons, but the bars were just as real. What made exile so terrifying wasn't just the loss of status, it was the silence that followed. A banished noble's name vanished from charters, their likeness painted over in family portraits, their deeds scrubbed from chronicles. To the court, they became unpersons, whispers at best, cautionary tales at worst. Yet history whispers back. The very act of erasure sometimes carved their names deeper into memory. After all, we remember Dante not despite his exile, but because of it. And that's the ultimate irony of banishment. Those cast out often found ways to haunt the halls that tried to forget them. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just navigate the medieval world, she rewrote its rules. At a time when most noble women were political pawns, this fiery queen became Europe's most dangerous player, wielding power through 2 royal marriages that spanned France and England. But her true genius lay in the shadows. While her first husband, Louis VII of France, embarked on the Second Crusade, Eleanor didn't wait patiently. she rode with him at the head of her own battalion of Aquitaine knights, her presence a living challenge to anyone who thought queens belonged in tapestries, not battle plans. When their marriage crumbled, she didn't fade into obscurity. She married Henry II of England just 8 weeks later, turning her vast lands into the cornerstone of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Spain. Then there was the art of regency, where women like Blanche of Castile ruled France in all but name while her son Louis IX came of age. Officially, she was merely keeping the throne warm, but her policies crushing rebellions, negotiating treaties, even leading armies, proved regents could be more formidable than kings. Blanche understood the power of perception. She dressed in summer gowns, framing herself as a devoted mother rather than a hungry usurper, all while her edicts reshaped the kingdom's borders. But no one mastered the covert game like Margaret Beaufort. At 13, she gave birth to the future Henry VII amid the bloody Wars of the Roses, then spent decades maneuvering him toward the throne through a web of alliances so intricate even seasoned diplomats marveled. Her letters, written in cipher with ink that faded after reading, reveal a mind that treated politics like three-dimensional chess. While men swung swords on battlefields, Margaret brokered marriages, bribed jailers to free allies, and even smuggled gold to rebels, all while maintaining the pious facade of a devout widow. Isabella of France took a different approach. When her husband Edward II's favoritism toward corrupt advisors bankrupted England, she didn't beg or weep. She orchestrated history's most audacious housewife coup, returning from a diplomatic trip to Paris with an army of mercenaries. She toppled Edward, installed their son as puppet king, and ruled as the power behind the throne. Chroniclers called her the she-wolf of France, but the title wasn't an insult, it was terrified respect. These women shared one brutal lesson. In a world that denied them crowns, influence had to be seized sideways. They funded scholars to write favorable histories, commissioned portraits depicting them as pious matrons while pulling strings, and turned the very expectations of femininity into weapons. A queen kneeling in prayer at Mass wasn't just worshipping, she was signaling piety to the bishops whose support she needed. A gift of embroidered gloves to a rival's child wasn't kindness, it was a reminder that her spies could reach even nurseries. Perhaps their greatest legacy was the paper trail they left: letters in lemon juice ink, account books with coded entries, diaries where flower sketches hid troop movements. These weren't just personal notes, they were blueprints for power in a man's world, proving that while history remembers kings' battles, the real wars were often won by the women holding the pens. A child's laughter echoing through a castle's halls could be the sound of a kingdom's surrender. Hostage diplomacy turned royal heirs into living contracts, their innocence the collateral for treaties signed in blood and gold. When young nobles arrived at a rival court as guests, everyone understood the unspoken threat. One wrong move from their family, and the gilded cage became a dungeon. These weren't prisoners in chains, but pawns draped in velvet, their every meal a reminder of how quickly privilege could curdle into peril. Richard the Lionheart learned this brutal calculus firsthand. Captured by Duke Leopold of Austria on his return from the Crusades in 1192, the legendary warrior king spent over a year imprisoned while his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, scrambled to raise a staggering ransom, 150,000 marks, nearly 3 times England's annual revenue. The irony was exquisite. The man who dodged Saracen arrows now sat at the mercy of a Christian ally, his freedom contingent on silver ingots hauled across Europe. Richard's ordeal exposed the flaw in the system. Hostages only worked if their captors outlasted their usefulness, but not all hostage stories ended in negotiated releases. Take the tragic case of Arthur of Brittany, the 15-year-old heir to England's throne. who vanished into his uncle King John's custody in 1203. Contemporary chroniclers hinted at drunken rage and midnight stabbings, but the truth dissolved into rumor, just another missing prince in a dynasty built on borrowed loyalty. For every Richard ransomed gloriously home, there was an Arthur whose absence became a cautionary tale whispered between nobles at feast tables. The system's psychological toll was its true masterpiece. Young hostages like James I of Scotland, held by the English for 18 years, grew up straddling two identities, part honored guest, part perpetual stranger. James learned poetry and statecraft from his captors, skills he'd later used to rule and to resent. His captivity birthed both a cultured king and a simmering rage that would fuel Scotland's independence wars. Similarly, the sons of Welsh princes raised in Edward I's court absorbed English customs even as their homeland burned, a cruel irony that turned them into outsiders in both worlds. Yet sometimes the chessboard flipped. When young Charles of Orleans was taken prisoner at Agincourt in 1415, his 25-year captivity birthed some of France's most poignant poetry. His verses, heavy with longing, transformed him from a bargaining chip into a cultural icon, proof that even in confinement, a hostage could wield soft power sharper than any sword. The greatest risk of this system wasn't its brutality but its predictability. Rulers who relied too heavily on hostages often forgot that flesh and blood pawns could develop minds of their own. The children who survived their gilded cages returned home with intimate knowledge of their captors' weaknesses and a lifetime to plot their revenge. In the end, hostage diplomacy wasn't just about controlling the present. It was gambling with the future, one royal heir at a time. Fabricated legitimacy was the medieval world's most audacious magic trick, turning lies into crowns with nothing but parchment and audacity. Take Henry IV, the German king who deposed Emperor Henry III by claiming divine visions ordained his rise. His genius wasn't in battle strategy but in storytelling, weaving heavenly signs and discovered prophecies into a narrative so compelling even his enemies hesitated to challenge it. After all, who dares argue with God's apparent favorite? Then there was the donation of Constantine, an 8th century forgery so brazen it shaped European politics for centuries. Purportedly written by Emperor Constantine himself, the document granted the Pope dominion over Rome and vast swaths of territory, conveniently justifying the Church's earthly power. Never mind that historians later proved it a fabrication. For 700 years, this single piece of vellum was the ultimate trump card in power struggles between kings and popes. The lesson was clear. In an age without archives or fact-checkers, the best story won. Genealogies became another battlefield of fiction. When William the Conqueror needed to legitimize his invasion of England in 1066, his scribes traced his lineage back to a long-dead Anglo-Saxon king, painting the Norman conquest as a rightful inheritance rather than a bloody land grab. Rivals countered with their own embellished family trees, some stretching all the way to biblical figures or Trojan heroes. The wilder the claim, the harder it was to disprove, especially when the claimant controlled the monks writing the chronicles. Relics joined the arsenal of deception. A splinter marketed as wood from Christ's cross could transform a petty lord into a pilgrimage magnet, filling his coffers with devotees' offerings. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, no stranger to skepticism, reportedly mocked the overabundance of authentic, saintly bones by quipping that he'd seen enough nails from the crucifixion to shoe a cavalry. Yet even he understood their political value, strategically donating relics to churches to secure loyalty. The true brilliance of these fabrications lay in their unverifiability. In a world where few could read and even fewer had access to historical records, a well-placed miracle or ancient charter could rewrite reality overnight. When King Alfonso X of Castile compiled his histories, he didn't just record events, he curated them, blending fact and legend until his kingdom's past glowed with divine favor. By the time critics pieced together the truth, the lie had already hardened into tradition. Perhaps that's why these tactics still resonate today. Modern politicians may not claim angelic visions, but the game remains the same. Control the narrative, and you control the throne. The parchment may have swapped for pixels, but the hunger for legitimacy, however manufactured, endures. After all, power belongs to those who can make others believe in their right to wield it. The feigned retreat was more than a battlefield tactic. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, where appearing weak became the ultimate strength. Picture this: Edward III's cavalry charging headlong at French lines during the 100 Years' War, only to suddenly wheel away in apparent panic. To the enemy, it looked like retreat. In reality, it was a coiled spring. As French knights broke formation to pursue, they stumbled straight into hidden pits and English longbowmen waiting just beyond the ridge. The lesson: sometimes the deadliest move is stepping back just enough to let your opponent's arrogance trip them up. But this art wasn't confined to muddy battlefields. In the courts of Europe, feigned retreat took subtler, deadlier forms. When Henry II of France faced rebellion from the powerful House of Guise, he didn't confront them head-on. Instead, he showered them with titles and lands, playing the gracious monarch while quietly undermining their alliances. By the time the Guises realized they'd been isolated, their power had evaporated like morning mist. The same principle applied to diplomacy. A king might publicly yield on a minor trade dispute, only to extract concessions on a far grander scale once his rival's guard was down. The key to a successful feint: timing. Too hasty and the ruse collapsed; too slow and the opportunity vanished. Take Richard the Lionheart's siege of Acre. By pretending to abandon his siege engines, he lured Saladin's forces into the open, then pivoted to crush them. Yet this wasn't just military genius, it mirrored the patience required in political chess. When Queen Isabella of Castile needed to unseat her half-brother Enrique IV, she didn't rally armies immediately. She waited, letting Enrique's own mismanagement turn the nobility against him until the throne practically fell into her lap. Feigned retreat also had a darker cousin: the strategic collapse. The Borgias famously allowed their rivals to believe they'd won, only to stage a miraculous resurgence backed by freshly bought allies. In 1503, Cesare Borgia let rebellions fester in his territories, drawing out every disloyal noble into the open before crushing them in one bloody sweep. The message was clear: sometimes you had to let the fire burn to see who'd get scorched. Yet the tactic carried immense risk. A ruler who retreated too often risked appearing feeble, inviting real challenges. King John of England's constant vacillations, yielding to the Pope one day, reneging the next, eroded trust until even his allies abandoned him. And then there was the ultimate danger: the feint that became reality. When Vlad the Impaler pretended to flee from Mehmed II's forces, the Ottomans pursued only to find the roads lined with impaled corpses, a grotesque reminder that some retreats were traps. But when Vlad's own boyars later turned against him, his signature tactic failed. The withdrawal wasn't calculated, and his reign ended in betrayal. What made this strategy so enduring was its duality. On the surface, it spoke of patience and control, but beneath lay a razor's edge of peril. Whether on horseback or in a throne room, the feigned retreat demanded more than cunning. It required the steel nerves to let your enemy believe they'd won, just long enough to ensure their defeat. Because in the end, the greatest power wasn't always in advancing. but in knowing precisely when to step back and how far. Blackmail was the dagger hidden in the velvet glove of medieval politics. Consider the fate of the Knights Templar, once Christendom's most powerful order. Their downfall didn't begin on a battlefield but in the shadowy recesses of rumor, whispers of heresy, secret initiation rites, and even idol worship. King Philip IV of France didn't need armies to dismantle them. He weaponized scandal, using coerced confessions and public trials to turn revered warriors into reviled outcasts. Overnight, their sacred reputation became a noose, but the Templars were far from alone. In an era where lineage was everything, a single allegation of illegitimacy could topple dynasties. When William the Conqueror's enemies called him William the Bastard, it wasn't just an insult, it was a direct challenge to his right to rule. Centuries later, the same tactic nearly undid Elizabeth I. Catholic rivals circulated pamphlets alleging her mother Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII was invalid, rendering Elizabeth a bastard unfit for the throne. The Queen countered with a masterstroke, commissioning portraits emphasizing her Tudor red hair and father's regal bearing, turning her body into living proof of legitimacy. Even the pious weren't immune. Saints like Thomas Becket faced smear campaigns accusing them of pride or greed, their miracles recast as witchcraft. Bishops caught in brothels, whether truth or fabrication, found their influence crumbling faster than their alibis. The genius of these attacks lay in their plausibility. In a world without forensic evidence, guilt was often a matter of who told the most compelling story. The antidote to scandal, controlling the narrative before it controlled you. When Richard III faced rumors of murdering his nephews, he didn't just deny it. He staged a public display of piety, processing through London with priests and relics to craft an image of virtue. It failed spectacularly, proving that overcorrection could backfire. Meanwhile, savvy rulers like Emperor Frederick II turned gossip into spectacle, flaunting mistresses and exotic pets to cultivate an aura of untouchable audacity. If the world would talk, he'd give them a show too bold to be whispered. The most devastating scandals, though, targeted not just individuals but systems. The Avignon papacy's alleged corruption became fuel for reformers like Martin Luther centuries later. A single whispered doubt about a king's ability to father heirs could trigger civil war, as when Charles VI of France's bouts of madness led to rumors his children were illegitimate, igniting the Armagnac-Burgundian feud. In the end, these weren't just personal tragedies, they were power plays dressed as morality tales. A well-timed leak of letters, a staged discovery of treasonous correspondence, or even a strategically spread joke could achieve what armies couldn't, destroying trust. Because in a world where reputation was armor, scandal didn't just tarnish, it left you naked before your enemies. And as the Templars learned too late, once the whispers started, even the mightiest couldn't unhear them. Festivals weren't just celebrations, they were high-stakes performances where every gesture, every gift, every jousting lance carried the weight of a kingdom's future. Take the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, where Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France transformed a meadow into a shimmering stage of silk pavilions and wine fountains. On the surface, it was a spectacle of brotherhood, with knights competing in mock battles and feasts lasting days. But peel back the gilded veneer, and you'd find a simmering chess match. Henry's tent, taller than Francis, wasn't just a royal lodging. It was a deliberate one-upmanship, a silent claim of superiority. Even the jousts, choreographed to avoid humiliation, crackled with unspoken rivalry. When Francis famously wrestled Henry to the ground in a spontaneous match, the crowd gasped not at the sport but at the breach of protocol. A king's body wasn't supposed to touch the dirt, let alone by another monarch's hand. The moment was laughed off, but the message lingered. Beneath the velvet gloves, the claws were still out. Banquets served similar double duty. A feast might begin with lavish toasts, but the choice of seating could spark diplomatic fires. When Charles the Bold of Burgundy placed the Holy Roman Emperor's envoy below the salt, a medieval snub relegating him to lesser company, it wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated insult disguised as tradition. Even the food became propaganda. Richard II's infamous blanc-mange dishes, delicate blancmanges shaped like his heraldic symbols, weren't just desserts. They were edible declarations of power meant to awe guests into submission. Then there were the gifts, those Trojan horses of diplomacy. When the Byzantine emperor received a mechanical lion from the Venetians, its roaring mechanism and moving parts dazzled the court until someone realized it was also a not-so-subtle reminder of Venice's technological superiority. Likewise, Henry VIII's habit of gifting Anne Boleyn lavish jewels wasn't just romance. Each piece broadcast her rising status to observers scanning for cracks in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The true genius of these events lay in their deniability, a jousting accident that left a rival's champion with a broken arm unfortunate, a toast that coincidentally omitted a key ally's health. Merely an oversight, but everyone in attendance could read the subtext. Like modern-day summits cloaked in photo ops and handshakes, medieval festivals were where wars were averted, or quietly declared between bites of roast swan and sips of spiced wine. For the rulers who mastered this dance, the rewards were immense. A well-staged festival could secure marriages, intimidate enemies, or even rewrite public perception overnight. When Edward IV of England hosted a Christmas feast amid the Wars of the Roses, his decision to invite former rivals wasn't generosity, it was theater, designed to showcase his magnanimity and strength. The guests might have gritted their teeth through the merriment, but the commoners saw only a king secure enough to break bread with his foes, and in that gap between perception and reality, dynasties were made or unmade. Yet the risks were just as dramatic. A single misstep, a poorly chosen dish, a botched tournament maneuver could unravel years of careful image building. When King John of Bohemia, blind and aging, insisted on being led into battle at Crecy in 1346, his chivalric gesture backfired spectacularly. Instead of inspiring awe, his death became a cautionary tale about the perils of empty pageantry, because in the end, these spectacles weren't just about power. They were about proving who could walk the tightrope between showmanship and substance, and who'd plummet the moment the crowd stopped applauding. A splinter of the true cross wasn't just a sacred object, it was a political battering ram. In an age where heaven and earth blurred, relics became the ultimate currency of legitimacy. When Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, needed to cement an alliance with the French crown, he didn't send gold or soldiers. He gifted a thorn from Christ's crown, a treasure so potent it transformed the recipient into God's chosen overnight. This was relic diplomacy at its finest. Heavenly endorsements brokered like trade deals, where a saint's tooth could buy loyalty more reliably than an army. But relics weren't just for allies, they were weapons against dissent. The Bishop of Trier once silenced rebellious nobles by unveiling the seamless robe of Christ, a relic so awe-inspiring that even the most hardened rebels fell to their knees. The message was clear: defy the church, and you defied the divine itself. And then there were the fakes, so plentiful that Erasmus joked Europe could rebuild Noah's Ark with all the authentic fragments of the cross. Yet even dubious relics served a purpose. When the Fourth Crusade needed funding, enterprising clerics discovered new holy artifacts, auctioning them to pious nobles eager to buy their way into heaven. Faith, it seemed, could be monetized as easily as grain or silk. The most cunning rulers played both sides of this holy market. Charlemagne's successors planted relics in strategic monasteries, turning them into spiritual fortresses that doubled as intelligence hubs. Meanwhile, Byzantine emperors hoarded relics like state secrets, releasing them only to sway wavering allies. When the Turks threatened Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI paraded the Virgin Mary's robe through the streets, hoping divine intervention would save what diplomacy could not. Yet relics also carried risks. The wrong holy object in the wrong hands could spark rebellions, as when English peasants rallied around Thomas Becket's bones against Henry VIII's reforms. And when rival cities claimed the same saint's body like the three competing heads of John the Baptist, the resulting feud split Christendom into factions. In the end, relics were more than objects of devotion. They were the original propaganda tools, weaving divine authority into the fabric of power. A king with a saint's blessing didn't just rule, he reigned with heaven's stamp of approval. And in a world where belief moved armies that was worth more than any crown, a mercenary's oath wasn't written on parchment, it was scribbled in sand, shifting with the next tempting offer. The Italian condottieri, those glamorous sellswords of the Renaissance, didn't fight for king or country. Their loyalty was auctioned to the highest bidder between courses at a banquet. One season, they might be defending Milan's walls. The next, they'd be scaling those same walls for Venice, their banners swapped as easily as cloaks. These weren't soldiers, they were entrepreneurs of violence, and their business model thrived on chaos. Take the infamous Sir John Hawkwood, an Englishman who carved his legend in Italian gold. One day, he was Florence's champion, routing rivals with his white company. The next, he'd negotiate a truce that conveniently lined his pockets while leaving his employers stranded. Hawkwood's real genius wasn't warfare, it was contract law. He mastered the art of the condotter, the mercenary agreement riddled with loopholes need him to storm a castle. That had cost extra, change of plans, the breach of contract fee could bankrupt a city-state. Rulers hated him, but they couldn't win without him. The system's fragility was its feature, not a flaw. Mercenary captains like Francesco Sforza didn't just switch sides, they played them against each other, prolonging wars to keep pay flowing. When Sforza besieged Milan in 1450, he didn't rush the gates. He starved the city slowly, then magnanimously spared it in exchange for a dukedom. The man sent to crush a rebellion became the rebel-turned ruler, proving that in this game, the mercenary's ultimate loyalty was to his own ascent. Yet for all their treachery, mercenaries had rules. Betrayal required finesse. A condottero who switched sides too blatantly risked becoming unemployable. No one trusted a knife that spun in the hand. The smart ones, like Braccio da Montone, cultivated reputations as reliable traitors. Yes, he'd abandon you, but only after giving decent notice, like a courteous assassin. This twisted professionalism made mercenaries paradoxically predictable. You might not trust them to stay, but you could trust them to leave profitably. The real victims were the states that hired them. Florence's treasury bled dry funding mercenary wars, while Venice learned the hard way that you couldn't bribe loyalty into existence. After the condottieri abandoned them at the Battle of Moclodio in 1427, the Venetians pivoted to a standing army, a radical idea at the time. But even that couldn't erase the mercenary mindset. When Bartolomeo Colleone, Venice's own hired general, died, he left his fortune to the city, on condition they erect a golden statue of him in Piazza San Marco. The ultimate power move, even in death, the mercenary ensured he'd be paid. For rulers, the lesson was bitter but clear. Mercenaries could win battles, but they'd bankrupt your morals along with your treasury. Their true legacy wasn't in the lands they conquered, but in the precarity they exposed, that every alliance, every victory, every throne was just one fat purse away from collapse. A needle could be as mighty as a sword when it stitched the right story. The Bayeux Tapestry, that sprawling 70-meter embroidery, didn't just depict the Norman conquest, it rewrote it in colorful thread. Here was Harold Godwinson, the Saxon king, swearing an oath to William the Conqueror on holy relics, only to later break it, or so the tapestry claimed. The message was blatant. Harold wasn't just defeated, he was a perjurer who deserved his fate. Never mind that the only witnesses to this alleged oath were Normans. This wasn't history, it was conquest embroidered in wool and bias, designed to justify invasion to generations of viewers who couldn't read Latin but could certainly follow a visual narrative. Chronicles played the same game with ink instead of thread. Take the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where scribes loyal to Alfred the Great transformed his early defeats into strategic withdrawals, painting Viking victories as temporary setbacks in a divinely ordained comeback. These weren't objective records but survival tools. Kingdoms knew that controlling the past meant controlling the future. When Richard III's supporters needed to legitimize his usurpation, they didn't just document events, they curated them, scrubbing inconvenient truths like the vanished princes in the tower from official accounts. Chroniclers' quills were scalpels, excising whatever threatened the regime's narrative. Portraiture was no less manipulative. Hans Holbein the Younger didn't just paint Henry VIII, he engineered him. That iconic wide-legged stance, the jewels layered like armor, the unshakable gaze, pure propaganda. The real Henry, plagued by ulcers and obesity in his later years, bore little resemblance to this colossus on canvas. Yet the image stuck, cementing the king's power not through reality but through relentless repetition. Even flaws became virtues. Elizabeth I's portraits turned her aging face into a mask of ageless majesty, her pallor framed as otherworldly purity rather than failing health. Religious art joined the fray. When Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to fresco the Sistine Chapel, those soaring scenes weren't just decoration, they were a visual manifesto of papal authority. Every finger touch between God and Adam, every stern prophet glaring down, whispered the same lesson: the Church's power flowed directly from heaven. No wonder Luther later targeted religious imagery. He understood its hypnotic hold on illiterate masses. The genius of medieval propaganda lay in its subtlety. Unlike modern attack ads or slogans, it wrapped its messages in beauty and sanctity, making critique feel like sacrilege. A tapestry hanging in a cathedral wasn't just art, it was scripture in wool. A king's portrait wasn't vanity, it was statecraft in oils, and that's why these works endure. They remind us that every image, every chronicle, every stitch in time is a choice about what to show, what to hide, and who gets to decide. The past was never just recorded, it was designed one brushstroke, one paragraph, one golden thread at a time. Lawfare turned courtrooms into execution chambers with better acoustics. Joan of Arc's trial wasn't just about heresy, it was a masterclass in legal theatrics. Her judges, many of them French clerics loyal to England, scripted every moment like a morality play. They barred her from appealing to the Pope, denied her legal counsel, and even trapped her with doctrinal riddles no peasant could answer. When she insisted her visions came from God, they reframed her faith as witchcraft, her patriotism as treason. The verdict was inevitable because the process was designed to produce it. Her burning at the stake wasn't justice, it was performance art for a regime terrified of a teenage girl's influence. Outlawry took this brutality one step further. It erased a person's legal existence. Declare someone an outlaw, and suddenly they weren't just criminals, they were non-people stripped of protections. The legend of Robin Hood captures this perfectly. Whether he was real or folklore, his story resonated because it exposed the system's hypocrisy, a noble stealing land. Legal, a peasant stealing back, outlawed. Kings like Edward I used outlawry as a broom, sweeping rivals like William Wallace into the legal wilderness where they could be hunted without consequence. Wallace's gruesome execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered, wasn't just punishment. It was a billboard warning others what happened to those who defied the crown's narrative. Even the holiest institutions played this game. The medieval church's inquisitions functioned like spiritual lawfare, turning theological disagreements into capital crimes. When the Knights Templar were accused of heresy in the 14th century, their trials relied on confessions extracted through torture, then broadcast as proof of their guilt. The Pope, initially skeptical, eventually caved to King Philip IV's pressure, not because the evidence was compelling, but because the legal machinery had already rendered the Templars toxic. Their Grand Master Jacques de Molay's fiery execution was less about piety than about liquidating a rival financial empire under the guise of divine justice. The most insidious part, these systems claimed impartiality. Trials followed procedures, verdicts were lawful, and punishments had parchment justifications. But everyone knew the truth. The scales of justice tilted toward whoever held the heavier purse or the sharper sword. When Thomas More stood trial for refusing to endorse Henry VIII's divorce, the outcome was decided long before the first witness spoke. The jury included the king's cronies. The law had been rewritten to suit the moment, and More's famous wit couldn't outmaneuver a verdict written in advance. His beheading wasn't a miscarriage of justice, it was justice as designed. These weren't aberrations, they were features of the system. Legal violence allowed rulers to eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability. No need for messy assassinations when you could arrest a rival for obscure debt laws, or convict them of treason based on a lost document suddenly rediscovered. The lesson echoed through the ages. If you control the courts, you don't need to break the law. You just need to bend it until it snaps your enemies in half. A child king's crown weighed heavier than any adult's, not from gold, but from the hands tugging at its edges. Henry VI inherited England's throne at 9 months old, his cradle circled by wolves in velvet robes. For decades, his reign became a battleground for regents and relatives, each grafting their ambitions onto his fragile authority. The Duke of Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort clashed openly over control of the boy, their rival councils turning court into a chessboard where every move was made in Henry's name but never by his will. The tragedy wasn't just his eventual collapse into madness. It was how his youth trained the nobility to see the monarchy as a prize to be managed rather than a power to be revered. Yet puppet monarchs weren't always passive. Some learned to tug back on their strings. When the 13-year-old Charles V of France inherited a realm ravaged by war and revolt, his regents expected pliancy. Instead, he bided his time, absorbing statecraft from the shadows until he abruptly dismissed his uncle's clique at 16, declaring, "The kingdom is mine to hold." His reign would become one of Europe's most formidable proof that even figureheads could sharpen themselves against their handlers. The real danger lay in the regents themselves. Men like Richard of York, who ruled as protector during Henry VI's bouts of instability, didn't just administer the realm, they reshaped it in their image. Patronage flowed to their allies, rivals found themselves exiled on flimsy charges, and chronicles suddenly emphasized the king's weakness as justification for their growing power. The line between stewardship and usurpation blurred until, in some cases, it vanished entirely. Then there were the women who mastered the shadows. Queen Catherine de' Medici, widowed when her sons were young, wielded influence through 3 successive reigns, first as regent, then as the power behind the throne. Her infamous flying squadron of beautiful spies wasn't just a rumor, it was a strategic web stretching from ballrooms to battlefields. While her sons bore titles, she held the ledger books, the treaties, and the poison rings. But puppets could become puppeteers in the right light. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV was elected as a pawn at 14, only to spend his adulthood systematically dismantling the electoral system that had elevated him. His Golden Bull of 1356 didn't just tweak succession rules, it codified them so meticulously that future regents found their hands tied. A brilliant irony, the very mechanisms used to control him became the tools he used to neuter their successors. The lesson of these shadow reigns wasn't just about power's corruption, it was about its illusions. A throne might look solid from a distance, but its stability often depended on who stood behind it, whispering, and who knew when to stop listening. For every Henry VI who crumbled under borrowed authority, there was a Frederick II who turned his regents into stepping stones. The difference lay not in their crowns, but in recognizing when to cut the strings before the strings cut them. Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't just endure captivity, she weaponized it. Locked away in Lochleven Castle after her forced abdication, the deposed monarch transformed her prison into a command center. A smuggled sewing needle became her lockpick, stitching secret letters into fabric carried by laundresses. The guards who were supposed to watch her, slowly bribed with promises of future favor, their loyalty eroded like the castle's damp stones. Then came the masterstroke, a teenager's face. Dressed as a laundress herself, her famous auburn hair hidden beneath a coarse hood, Mary simply walked out the gates while her allies staged a drunken diversion. Within weeks, she'd rallied 6,000 men to her banner at Langside, proof that in medieval politics, a fugitive with the right name could turn a jailbreak into a revolution. Not every escape relied on stealth. Richard the Lionheart's legendary flight from Duke Leopold's dungeon was pure audacity. Disguised as a kitchen servant, he might have slipped away quietly until a careless moment holding a hunting hawk betrayed his noble bearing. What followed was a mad dash across Europe, complete with fake merchant caravans and safe houses manned by troubadours who'd once sung his praises. The message was clear: captivity couldn't contain a ruler who turned his own myth into a getaway vehicle. The real genius of these prison breaks lay in their psychological impact. When Charles the Bold of Burgundy's enemies imprisoned Louis XI of France in 1465, they expected submission. Instead, Louis used his captivity to study his jailers, learning their routines, their grudges, even which guards gambled too heavily. By the time he negotiated his release, he knew exactly which men to bribe or blackmail later. His imprisonment hadn't weakened him, it had given him a ledger of future leverage. Some escapes bordered on the fantastical. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV's flight from his rebellious son's siege in 1105 involved lowering himself from a castle window by bedsheets only to get stuck halfway, dangling helplessly until rescuers improvised a ladder from spears and cloaks. The humiliation should have crippled his authority. Instead, it became a rallying cry, painting him as a desperate father betrayed rather than a failed ruler. The most dangerous prisoners, though, were the ones who never left their cells. John the Blind of Bohemia, imprisoned by the French in 1334, turned his dungeon into a shadow court. Letters smuggled in wine barrels kept his allies mobilized, while carefully staged illnesses pressured his captors to improve his conditions. By the time he was ransomed, his influence had grown so potent that his jailers practically paid him to leave. What made these escapes so thrilling wasn't just the physical daring. It was the way they exposed power's fragility. A single fleeing queen could unravel years of carefully plotted regime change. A king's midnight dash across borders could reignite wars thought long settled, because in the end, medieval prisons weren't just built of iron and stone. They were made of fear, complacency, and the arrogant assumption that walls could hold someone the world refused to forget. Language was the quiet conqueror, slipping into minds where swords couldn't reach. When William the Conqueror made Norman French the official tongue of England's courts after 1066, it wasn't just a bureaucratic change, it was cultural surgery. Imagine an Anglo-Saxon earl, his family's lineage stretching back centuries, suddenly rendered mute in his own halls unless he stumbled through the guttural vowels of his invader's speech. Legal documents, royal decrees, even the gossip of power now flowed in a language designed to exclude. The message was clear: adapt or become irrelevant. Within generations, the Old English aristocracy either learned to twist their tongues around Norman phrases or faded into obscurity, their ancestral voices drowned out by the clatter of French verbs. But words were just the beginning. Fashion became another battlefield of assimilation. Norman-style tunics, tighter and shorter than traditional Anglo-Saxon garb, swept through noble circles, not because they were warmer or more practical, but because wearing them signaled allegiance. A lord who clung to his long, loose Saxon robes might as well have worn a sign declaring himself an outsider. Even hairstyles turned political. The Normans favored clean-shaven faces and cropped hair, a stark contrast to the beards and flowing locks of Saxon tradition. To trim was to submit. Every razor stroke chipped away at resistance. The most insidious subversion happened at the table. Norman dining customs, multiple courses served on trenchers instead of communal bowls. Wine favored over ale transformed meals into performances of loyalty. A noble hosting a feast faced a fraught decision: serve Saxon style and risk seeming backward, or adopt Norman pomp and alienate traditionalists. These weren't just social choices, they were survival strategies in a world where the wrong bread or cup could mark you as a holdout. Religion got the same treatment. Norman bishops replaced Saxon clergy, bringing continental liturgy that sounded foreign to local ears. Churches once adorned with intricate Celtic knotwork were rebuilt in soaring Romanesque arches, their very stones proclaiming the new order. Even saints weren't safe. Local Anglo-Saxon holy figures saw their feast days downgraded while Norman favorites like St. Michael gained prominence. Yet the brilliance of this soft conquest lay in its selective absorption. The Normans didn't erase Englishness, they remixed it. Over time, Norman French blended with Old English like threads in a tapestry, birthing Middle English, a linguistic hybrid that gave us words like beef from French boeuf for the animal on a noble's plate, while the Saxon cow stuck for the creature in a peasant's field. This linguistic apartheid mirrored society itself, the conqueror's tongue for power, the conquered's for drudgery. The lesson echoed far beyond England. When the Spanish Habsburgs imposed Castilian customs on Catalonia, or the Ottomans required Balkan elites to wear turbans, they weren't just changing wardrobes, they were rewriting identities. Because culture, it turns out, is the slowest and stickiest form of domination. Armies could be resisted, taxes evaded, but few could withstand the relentless tide of new words, new tastes, new ways of being that seeped into daily life until the old ways felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it didn't just claim lives, it rewrote the rules of power. As corpses piled in the streets, terrified populations demanded answers, and rulers were quick to supply them. The Jews, they claimed, had poisoned the wells. Never mind that Jewish communities died at the same horrific rates as their neighbors. Pogroms erupted from Strasbourg to Barcelona, fueled by royal decrees that turned grief into a weapon. For monarchs drowning in unrest, heresy became a convenient pressure valve. Burn a few scapegoats, and the mob's fury might spare the throne. But the opportunistic weren't always so blunt. The Little Ice Age's relentless frosts, which destroyed harvests for decades, taught rulers a subtler art. When wheat failed in 17th century France, Louis XIV didn't blame the weather. He blamed Protestant Huguenots stripping their lands under the guise of divine punishment. Across the Channel, England's Charles I faced riots over bread prices, only for Parliament to reframe the crisis as proof of his mismanagement, a narrative that would cost him his head. Climate became politics by other means, with starving peasants as the unwitting infantry in elite power struggles. Even seemingly neutral disasters could be flipped into propaganda. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was likely an accident, but that didn't stop rumors of Catholic arsonists, a fiction eagerly amplified to justify harsher penalties against religious minorities. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, earthquakes weren't just geological events but celestial verdicts. Emperor Justinian rebuilt Constantinople after a 6th century quake, not just for safety, but to stage his piety, inscribing churches with boasts that his faith had literally moved the earth. The real masters of disaster politics, though, were the Medici. When floods ravaged Florence, they didn't just repair bridges, they rebuilt them wider, ensuring their merchant caravans had priority access. Relief grain was distributed first to loyal neighborhoods, turning full bellies into votes. Every catastrophe became a ledger entry: who suffered, who benefited, and how the balance of influence might shift. Yet these tactics carried a fatal risk. A ruler who blamed too freely risked seeming impotent against God's wrath, while those who profited too visibly invited backlash. When Lisbon was shattered by an earthquake in 1755, the Marquis of Pombal didn't scapegoat. He rebuilt with seismic-resistant designs, turning tragedy into a showcase of Enlightenment progress. The lesson echoed through the centuries. Disasters didn't just test a leader's morality, they exposed their imagination, because in the end, the same flood that drowned one regime could float another to power if they knew how to sail the storm. A dying king's final signature wasn't just ink on parchment, it was a lit fuse trailing into the future. Henry I of England learned this too late. On his deathbed in 1135, he named his daughter Matilda as heir, a radical choice that should have secured his legacy. Instead, it plunged England into 19 years of civil war known as the Anarchy. Why? Because his nephew Stephen of Blois snatched the crown while Matilda's supporters still mourned, proving that a will was only as strong as the swords willing to enforce it. The chaos that followed wasn't just about succession. It was a masterclass in how deathbed decrees could unravel entire kingdoms when ambition outlived authority. But not all rulers left their heirs such poisoned chalices. Some crafted wills so meticulous they governed from the grave. When Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV drafted his Golden Bull in 1356, he didn't just name successors, he codified the election process itself, binding future princes to rules etched in imperial gold. His document didn't just distribute lands, it engineered stability, turning what could have been a free-for-all into a choreographed dance of power, the difference between Henry's disaster and Charles' triumph. One treated his will as a wish, the other as a legal fortress. Yet even the most carefully laid plans could crumble under family greed. King Alfonso XII of Castile discovered this when his deathbed division of territories among his sons sparked a century of fratricidal wars. His intention, to give each boy a kingdom, only ensured they'd spend their lives fighting over the pieces. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, Emperor John V's 11th hour disinheritance of his son Andronikos failed spectacularly when the spurned prince simply tore up the document and threw his father into prison. Paper, it seemed, was no match for passion. The most cunning testators played psychological games. King Louis XIV of France's will wasn't just a list of bequests, it was a trap. By leaving his illegitimate sons substantial estates but excluding them from the succession, he guaranteed they'd spend their wealth defending his legitimate heir against jealous nobles. Every coin they inherited became a chain binding them to the throne's survival. Wills also became weapons in proxy wars. When Edward III of England named his infant grandson Richard II as heir over his living sons, he didn't just invite rebellion, he handed France a perfect pawn. The boy's shaky claim gave the French monarchy endless opportunities to meddle, turning what should have been a private grief into a continental crisis. Perhaps the cruelest twist was how often these documents betrayed their author's deepest fears. Henry VIII's obsessive tinkering with his will, demanding male heirs, then female, then any blood relative, revealed a man so terrified of oblivion that he legislated his lineage like a desperate playwright rewriting his finale. In the end, his meticulous plan still led to Elizabeth I's illegitimate rise, proving that not even kings could dictate how history would remember them. The lesson etched into these crumbling parchments: a will wasn't a conclusion, it was an opening move in a game the dead could no longer play. Whether it brought order or anarchy depended less on the words themselves than on the living hands that chose to honor or ignite